Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and a very, very warm welcome to the Aga Khan Museum. And we do mean warm, even if you might be feeling a little cold at the moment. We have asked our colleagues to turn down the air conditioning and hope that you feel a little bit more cozy in no time. My name is Ulrika Al-Khamis. I am the Director of Collections and Public Programs here at the Aga Khan Museum, and I'm very happy to see so many of you here this afternoon to listen to our exciting lecture. Before I begin, though, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which the Aga Khan Museum stands has been a land of cultural encounter for many, many hundreds of years. Under the stewardship of the indigenous people of Turtle Island, including the Huron-Wendat, the Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. We honor them and we express our sincere gratitude. It is my great pleasure and honor to welcome and to introduce one of the prominent personalities in the fields of Islamic and Indian art, Dr. Navina Najat Haidar, curator in the Department of Islamic Art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. She's an internationally renowned and respected scholar and one of the curators instrumental in the redisplay of the Metropolitan Museum's permanent Islamic art galleries. She has organized several special exhibitions focused on the arts of South Asia, including Sultans of Deccan, India, Opulence and Fantasy, Treasures from India, Rajput painting, and others. Navina is a very respected and prolific author and lecturer in her field, and she also teaches courses on Indian and Islamic manuscript painting and connoisseurship. And currently, she is busy with organizing a future exhibition on the Mughals, a book on Mughal Jali screens, and a research project on diamonds. I don't know where you find the time to do all these things. Today, Navina will talk to us about jewels of consequence in India's Mughal age, unlocking some of the fascinating stories behind the empire's ostentatious cult and culture of gemstones, used not only in the context of personal connoisseurship, ornamentation, talismanic protection, and gift-giving, but also, and much more importantly, for the projection of absolute, unassailable political, economic, and social power. Before I invite Dr. Navina to the podium, may I please ask you all to silence your cell phones? And I have to also remind you that the recording of voice and video is not permitted in the auditorium. And now please join me in welcoming our very special guest this afternoon, Dr. Navina Najat Haidar.
Thank you so much for that very warm introduction. And I would like to begin today by thanking the Aga Khan Museum for this kind invitation to speak and for the care and the trouble that colleagues here have taken with all the arrangements and the help in welcoming me here. The occasion of my talk today is in connection with the recent opening of the exhibition that's on upstairs, which displays the collection of the Al Sabah collection in Kuwait, along with paintings from the Aga Khan collection. As a curator at the Met in New York many years ago, we had the privilege of installing the Aga Khan, the Al Sabah jewels actually in 2001, and then again in 2015 when we borrowed some of them for the Deccan exhibition. So for me, it's a bit like meeting old friends. I've seen them installed in other settings before, but I have to say that the exhibition upstairs is one of the most beautiful installations of this material that I've seen. So I'd like to really congratulate my colleagues here at the Aga Khan and congratulate all those who are responsible for this wonderful installation. Now, almost every human culture has produced its own form of jewelry and jeweled arts, utilizing materials ranging from delicate cowrie shells and brilliantly colored feathers to rare metals and gemstones. Imbued with talismanic or sacred meaning, or cherished as embodiments of personal memory and experience, gems and precious ornaments have held an extraordinary grip on the human imagination. In history, the rise and fall of kings and empires are often intertwined with stories of precious objects, while power and identity are mirrored in the glittering facets of a gemstone. The Mughals, an Indian dynasty with Central Asian origins, are particularly famed for their commitment to the jeweled arts and to opulent design. The Mughal period from the mid-16th to the mid-19th century has bestowed upon us a bounty of precious objects, including several dated and specific examples, which take their place in the dramatic theater of Mughal history. My talk today will center on those Mughal jewels of consequence as keys to the fascinating historical characters who owned them and to the interconnected political and cultural worlds that they inhabited. The founder of the Mughal dynasty, Babur, who arrived in India in 1526, was an exiled prince of the Timurid dynasty, a Sunni Muslim ruling house of Turco-Mongol origins, descended from the conqueror Timur and based in Central Asia, modern-day Uzbekistan, after whom they are named. The brilliant patronage of art and intellectual life in India and Central Asia by the Timurid house was a model for Babur and his Mughal descendants, who carried the dream of reconquering those lands throughout the 17th century. However, their future lay not in Central Asia, but in India, where Mughal art became a blend of existing Indian styles with influences from these Central Asian origins. And this map gives you a sense of the Mughal Empire, the sort of westward direction from which Babur came, and the extent to which his descendant Akbar had conquered and consolidated the empire, and then this part, the Deccan Plateau, that was later conquered by the last of the so-called Great Mughals, Aurangzeb. But in essence, this entire polity that we now call India was very much formed in this period and is something that we have inherited from this period in modern times, with various additions and subtractions through the colonial period. Now, this painted folio, which is on display in the exhibition, is a genealogical chart of part of the Timurid Mughal lineage, made in about 1623 to 27 for Babur's descendant, the fourth Mughal Emperor Jahangir, who is shown at the center top. It was probably once in the form of a long firman or scroll with an illuminated headpiece and a long body bearing a family tree, now cut down and assembled on a single folio. From the Mughal point of view, such sets of images traces their family tree and their line of descent from the Mongols, the word Mughal being a variation of that same word. Now you can see here in the details, you have Jahangir up there, and right around him are his four sons, and around them are their sons. And I particularly like the small boys who are fast asleep or barely awake on their little cushions. And here below you see one of their Timurid ancestors with various members of the Timurid family, and that sense of lineage is really what comes across even with the fragments of this original scroll. Now, if you look at this map, you'll see that Mughal India became an important hub for the import, export, and exchange of gemstones and precious materials. While diamonds, rubies, and sapphires were to be found in and around the subcontinent itself, other items, such as emeralds, came from South America, while pearls were brought in from the Gulf. And there are several examples of spectacularly carved emeralds in the exhibition, a special skill of the Indian lapidary and craftsman. In fact, Indian craftsmen generally fashioned these hard materials in naturalistic, floral-based styles that combine the long-standing jewel traditions and tastes of the subcontinent and absorbed also the new influences that were coming in. Objects such as a Navratna jeweled belt buckle on show upstairs exemplify this marriage of tastes. A belt buckle or sash holder is in the form of a flower, with each petal rendered in a different color of gem. This system is that of the 9 auspicious jewels, or the Navratan, and derived from an Indian astrological tradition related to the association of precious stones with planets. Here the sun is in the middle, 5 planets, the moon, and 2 phases of the moon together make up the 9 gems. But you'll see that these gems are all set in a material, a light greenish material, which is nephrite jade, known as yasm. And the nephrite jade into which the gems are set is actually a sort of taste, if you like, that is imported from Chinese Central Asia. This precious material, which comes in shades of color from very, very dark green to almost black to pale and translucent white, was believed in China to be the frozen sperm of dragons. Now, in the jeweled arts, Central Asian taste is also reflected in the Mughal love of large polished spinels, known as lal, a purple-red hardstone from the Badakhshan region of Afghanistan, which is often confused for ruby, hence the term balas ruby, by which they are also known. Spinels, however, have a different formulation of crystals, related more to sapphires, and they come in larger sizes. For the Mughals, they came to hold intimate dynastic association, with elegant royal inscriptions being carved into their surface. The Al-Sabah collection contains a number of such inscribed spinels, including a rare example from the period of Akbar, the greatest figure perhaps of the Mughal dynasty, although the largest number of these spinels actually seem to come from the time of his son Jahangir, who particularly bore a love for his ancestral lands. One single such jewel traces that important Timurid Mughal lineage that I showed you, and is in fact one of the most important gems in history, and on view upstairs in this exhibition in a case all by itself as soon as you enter. It's on the left-hand side. This 249.3 carat spinel of velvety pink-purple hue bears 6 royal inscriptions ranging from the 15th to the 18th centuries, finely carved in distinct calligraphic styles, naskh and nastaliq, on its surface. Tracing these inscriptions and the story of the stone as it passed from Ulugh Beg of the Timurid dynasty to Shah Abbas of the Safavid family to Jahangir, Shah Jahan, Aurangzeb of the Mughal house, and finally to Ahmad Shah Durrani of the Afghan dynasty, mirrors the shifts of power between India, Iran, and Central Asia, and reveals the tastes and techniques of jewelry and collecting that evolved. The earliest inscription to be found on the surface of the Al-Sabah spinel is that of the Timurid prince Ulugh Beg, who lived from 1394 to 1449. This is an undated inscription reading Ulugh Beg bin Shahrukh Bahadur. Ulugh Beg, Timur's grandson and son of Shahrukh, was a man of science, best known for his astronomical studies and advances, particularly the observatory built in Samarkand between 1424 and 29, where he made improvements actually on Ptolemy's calculations that were still being used. Ulugh Beg's territories encompassed the Badakhshan region in Afghanistan from where the spinel was mined, and it stands alone in the Timurid world as the only such known inscribed large polished spinel of the period. The inscription either wheel-cut or more likely engraved with a diamond-pointed stylus, as scholars have speculated. According to Suren Milikian, for Iranians, these red stones contained great metaphorical meaning in literature and poetry, where spinels are likened to wine and thought of as flowing with crystallized light. Spinels also have a royal association, appearing in descriptions and painted representations of a type of Persian crown, and also seals, including surfaces upon which names of kings were engraved. This symbolism was widely understood beyond Iran within a network that the historian Richard Eaton has termed the Persian Cosmopolis, a broad social culture unified by the literary traditions of New Persian, which provided a lingua franca for much of the Middle East and India in this period. The appearance of spinels and the use of hard stones as surfaces for auspicious inscriptions in medieval Iran can be traced in the study of archaeological and medieval material, where they appear in far more humble guise. For example, Marian Wenzel has catalogued at least 2 examples of early medieval Persian rings in the Khalili collection that incorporate spinel. These are rare examples of rings made with sheet gold that is stamped with decoration and niello, and each bear in their broad claws an oval cabochon spinel, one a dark red and the other a paler pink. As with most gems of the medieval period, the stones are small, perhaps somewhat shaped and polished, but fundamentally uncut, preserving their volume and uninscribed. Derek Content illustrates an important Mongol ring of the golden hoard type of the 14th century that contains a central sapphire pebble flanked by a cabochon ruby and a spinel. So this is this ring that I'm showing you different views of. So those are the 3 stones, and you can see the color difference between the spinel and the ruby. The spinel is a little bit darker usually. And also, interestingly, visible here is a pendant that recently was discovered. This actually comes from Vijayanagar, way down south in India, which is, and probably is datable to the 15th century, maybe the early 16th century. It's a pendant in the shape of a very charming bee, which has several spinels incorporated in its design and other gems, and it demonstrates how far away from Badakhshan these gems were traveling in this period. And in fact, I could have also shown you a medieval European brooch with a spinel in it, quite a rare thing. But I guess all these spinels tend to be quite small, but they are now already in late medieval times quite widely dispersed. There are other examples from the world of medieval rings and small seals and objects that bear inscriptions carved into various surfaces, including jade, steatite, carnelian, lapis lazuli, and there are certain basic aspects to this tradition. In terms of the contents of inscriptions, they could be talismanic, image-based, calligraphic, or bearing a name or title. In terms of technique, they could be engraved into the surface, raised in relief from a surface, executed in reverse so as to act as a seal, or readable and inscribed just directly as a kind of surface to write on. It has been suggested that talismanic inscriptions and talismanic objects seem to have become more common in the 13th century, perhaps as a reaction caused by the Mongol invasions, but the Mongols themselves introduced new technical and decorative ideas, such as Chinese-style ink seals based on relief inscriptions. These examples that I've shown you demonstrate some of the main strategies and uses of engravings upon hard stones and the presence of occasional spinels. However, we note that the spinel is rare among them and that gemstones in large sizes are also rare. So the Ulugh Beg spinel immediately stands out for its extraordinary size, almost 250 carats, and may for that reason have appealed as the most prestigious surface to engrave a royal inscription on. There may also have been developments in mining and the obtaining of hard stones between the late medieval age and the Timurid age that advanced the discovery and the use of such large stones. After all, Ulugh Beg himself was responsible for placing a gigantic block of inscribed jade as the tombstone for his grandfather Timur. In this instance, Ulugh Beg ordered 2,000 of his men to transport from Karshi to Samarkand 2 large blocks of nephrite, one of which became the tombstone, and incidentally, this remains the largest block of nephrite jade in the world. So not only do we see new wealth, great volumes of material in the Timurid court, but also we see the finest workmanship that brought out the beauty and the potential of these natural resources. That Ulugh Beg employed masters of hard stone carving is amply testified by the exquisite jade objects that were made for him. We see here 2 outstanding nephrite jade vessels made for Ulugh Beg. One is a small green vessel with a handle in the form of a flattened chi, or mythical hornless Chinese dragon. The second is a famous ewer with a dragon handle also, which came later into the possession of the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, who actively collected works of art from the period of his ancestors. Now, some of the craftsmen working for Ulugh Beg may even have been of Indian descent in Central Asia, for Timur had brought craftsmen from many parts of his conquered lands to Central Asia to build and contribute there. Now, Ulugh Beg's great Inscribed Spinel, did not, however, directly pass down through the Timurid line to his Mughal descendants. For at the end of the 15th century, there was another great disruption in Central Asia and Iran that profoundly changed the power dynamics of the region, and this is the rise of the Safavid dynasty and their conquest of Iran. The Safavids, a dynasty whose origins lay in a mystical order at the turn of the 14th century, established themselves as rulers of Iran in 1501 and instituted Shi'ism as a new state religion. Their rise posed a threat to both the Ottomans in the west and the Mughals in the east, but equally, these so-called gunpowder empires shared deep cultural norms and practices. Iran's greatest Safavid ruler is widely recognized as Shah Abbas I, who in 1598 moved the capital to Isfahan and is also credited with a wide number of social, economic, and political reforms, as well as great building and art projects. Among the many lasting legacies of his age is the glorious city of Isfahan itself, particularly its Maidan, famous for its beautiful order and dazzling tiled buildings, and you see a view of the Maidan on the screen there. Now, it is Shah Abbas's title and name that follows Ulugh Beg's on the Spinel, added in 1617, about 168 years after the first. This inscription states, Bandeye Shah Velayat Abbas, servant of the King of Divine Delegation, and has a date of Hijri 1026 or 1615-16 or 1617. It has been suggested that the fact that his inscription lies perpendicular to the earlier Timurid one signals a dynastic gap. However, just as Timurid historians went to lengths to form connections with the Mongols, Safavid historians went to lengths to associate Shah Abbas with Timur and to present him as a divinely inspired figure. In any case, we do not find that the earlier inscription, the Timurid inscription, was polished off. Rather, we see the two inscriptions together, the one of Ulugh Beg and Shah Abbas, which is how a delighted Jahangir of India received the stone when Shah Abbas gifted it to him on the 17th of February in the year 1621, sent through his trusted envoys, Agha Beg and Mohib Ali. Jahangir recorded this in his personal memoirs, the Jahangirnama, and mentions this very stone that you see up there on the screen. The name Ulugh Beg bin Mirza Shah Rukh Bahadur bin Amir Taimur Gurkhan was inscribed on it in Naskh. As the name of my ancestors were inscribed on it, I took it as a sign of felicity and the granting of God's grace on me. Now you'll notice that it's not precisely what we have on, his description doesn't precisely match what we have on the stone now, because the stone doesn't in fact mention the name of Taimur himself. But, and it's a little question for historians who are working closely on this material as to how much accuracy, matters. I mean, the person who's handling the gem and describing it is more sort of likely to be accurate than we are hundreds of years later. But on the other hand, there are these strange discrepancies right in the moment itself. So one has to sort of critically read these texts and sources. Jahangir's exchanges with the court of Shah Abbas are expressed in a number of important interrelated developments in Mughal art and painting, which position this jewel within the light of an evolving relationship between the two courts, as well as in the development of the Mughal self-image under Jahangir. Much of the rivalry between the two states centered on the fort of Kandahar in Afghanistan. A strategic and prestigious asset, this fort was vied for by each ruler, eventually being claimed by the Persians in 1622. But despite this victory, many warm exchanges also took place, along with a number of official embassies, and the rulers referred to themselves as friends and brothers, Jahangir seeing himself as the older brother, despite the crushing loss at Kandahar. When the Mughal ambassador Khan Alam had earlier gone to the Persian court in 1613, he was accompanied by the Mughal painter Bishan Das, a great talent of the Mughal court, who was masterfully trained in the art of portraiture, among other skills, accurate portraiture being a great accomplishment and hallmark of Mughal painting by this date. And who was tasked, Bishan Das was tasked with capturing the likeness of Shah Abbas to gaze upon, for Jahangir to gaze upon, which indeed is likely part of the items of regular exchange for the two rulers who never actually met. From the pen of Bishandas, we thus have what might be the first and freshest sketch of the Persian Shah, a simple line drawing in the Barberini album. And Stuart Carey Welch, a former head of my department at the Met and a great connoisseur of Mughal painting, used to love this drawing because he said that it's so simple and it's so lively and it really captures a kind of, sort of intelligence and liveliness of the subject of the Shah. But several other more complex images followed in about 1618, including these two famous allegorical pictures depicting Jahangir embracing Shah Abbas and entertaining Shah Abbas. Now, you can see how magnificent they are. They come from an album known as the St Petersburg Album, which is distinguished by its absolutely extraordinary contents. Most of it is in St Petersburg, and some of the folios are dispersed in other collections. The album was later mounted in 18th century Iran with these beautiful floral borders that were done by a very known illuminator at the time, and it holds in its folio some of the great masterworks of the Mughal painting. So, if we look closer to these two paintings, we see that both these paintings carefully rework Elizabethan symbols, which were well known in Mughal court painting by this time, to place the two figures in a kind of dichotomy and in a dialogue in which Jahangir presides, and yet he's being terribly polite while doing so. In the painting closer to me, you see that Jahangir is all-powerful. He's surrounded by a brilliant golden solar halo, which also incorporates a lunar halo down below, if you can see that, which is being held up by little cherubs. And this absolutely huge halo is sort of all Jahangir's. And he embraces a slightly subservient and slightly sort of shorter, diminutive Shah Abbas, in a gesture that is at once affectionate and yet clearly dominant. Jahangir, they stand on a globe of the world. That's a sort of Elizabethan image. And you can see that Jahangir stands on the lion, while Shah Abbas stands on that very humble-looking ram. And the lion sort of occupies most of Asia and sort of nudges Shah Abbas's lamb out of Iran too. And all of this is to be read with full intent, and it's a very, very clear message that's being sent. In another wonderful imagined allegorical portrait, you see the two rulers shown together, Jahangir entertaining his royal guest upon a shared throne, while his brother-in-law, the important nobleman Asif Khan, stands at one end. That's Asif Khan. And Khan Alam, the same ambassador who went to Iran, stands at the other end. And here you see particular themes which relate closely to our discussion of the inscribed Spinel playing out. One of them is the importance of dynastic lineage as articulated in these inscriptions up above, which give the Mughal family tree from the Timurids downward. And secondly, you see the presence of important gifts on this table, precious objects as diplomatic forms of exchange. And the objects on the table include an Italian white ewer, a small brown porcelain Chinese lamp, and a Venetian glass. Shah Alam holds a golden sculpture. I don't know if you can see that right there. It's Diana on a stag, which was made in Augsburg in the late 16th century. Precious as these gifts are, it is doubtful that they could match the aura of the Timurid Spinel, which for Jahangir would have been almost unmatchable in its pedigree and lineage. Not only did it legitimize the Mughals' Timurid heritage, but it also touched upon another, less known but equally important symbolic side, that of the Mughals' entwinement with the Hindu Rajputs with whom they were intermarried. Red spinels were sacred in the Indian tradition too, and the Mughals inherited a great deal of symbolism and importance of gems and the metaphorical reading of gems from the great Hindu traditions, including the casting of horoscopes and the incorporation of important auspicious symbols. When Jahangir received the precious spinel from Shah Abbas, he immediately handed it over to be inscribed with his royal title to Saida Gilani. And he mentions in the Jahangirnama, I ordered Saida, the prefect of the goldsmith's workshop, to write on the other corner, Jahangir Shah bin Akbar Shah, with the date of the event. The figure of Saida Gilani has emerged into modern art history due largely to the scholarly efforts of Suren Melikian. This polymath, Saida, as his name implies, was an immigrant to the Mughal court from Gilan in Iran. Gifted as a lapidary, poet, calligrapher, and jeweler, he is named as the one honored with the task of inscribing the king's name on this precious relic, as he was a sort of leading figure at court. He did so. He added the king's title and also the regalia 16 over his name and the year of the event, 1621, below. In doing so, he introduced a certain parallelism between Jahangir and Shah Abbas. Saida's confident style can also be seen on other precious hearthstones of the period, including a wine cup of Jahangir now in the collection of Sheikh Hamad of Qatar, and that's closer to me. You might be able to see his name in there, if it's the right side of the cup. But it's a long inscription, and you might actually see that his name, Gilani's signature, so to speak, is in there. Excuse me. Now, the year is 1621. While this precious spinel has reached the Mughal courts, evoking their ancestral lands, the impending loss of Kandahar in Afghanistan was to deal a huge blow to the Mughal ambition of westward conquest. So there was only one real option for them left: to continue their expansion southward into the diamond-rich Deccan lands, presently under the rule of the Deccan sultans who succeeded the Bahmanid dynasty in the Plateau. In fact, the practice of sending Mughal princes to serve in the northern Deccan as governor had been going on since Jahangir's own princely service. But now it was a turn of his son Khurram, the future Shah Jahan, who was entrusted with the Deccan campaigns. The next name to be added to the spinel is that of Shah Jahan, who was given this title, King of the World, after a successful Deccan campaign. And you see that this is a page from the Windsor Padshahnama, a very famous illustrated manuscript now in the collection of the Queen's Palace in Windsor. And it illustrates essentially the reign of Shah Jahan. You see that there's, I have a detail, oops, excuse me. You see here that, pardon me. See here Jahangir handing over a spinel which is mounted as a turban ornament to Khurram. Now, slightly confusingly, there was another spinel that was also handed over to Khurram after another Deccan campaign, and scholars are not completely sure whether all of this ties up. This is what I mean about the critical reading, and not to get too carried away with these glorious stories. I'm showing this to you because it's a wonderful setting. You see the kind of presentation of these gems, you see the importance that they showed, but we can't be definitely sure that the Windsor page definitely illustrates this precise gem. But it's an interesting possibility which scholars have acknowledged. Now, Shah Jahan was perhaps the most passionate and erudite gem connoisseur of the 17th century anywhere, people have claimed anywhere. Paintings from his period frequently depict him examining gems. There are a great many references to gems. His understanding, knowledge, and interest in precious gems was almost unrivaled. Here we see him in a folio from the Met's Kevorkian album, where he is seated on a throne examining spinels with his young son, who's probably Dara Shikoh. In the exhibition, there is, well, I should just point out a few things about this painting. You see the name of the artist, Nanha. That was probably written on by Shah Jahan himself. Quite often, we can now recognize the handwriting of Shah Jahan and Jahangir because they quite often scribbled all over their own albums and told us who the artists were. And Nanha has put this, firstly, the borders are just so extraordinary and beautiful of this painting, but you can see in a close-up, the sort of beautiful jewel-like image of Shah Jahan himself. I mean, portraiture in this period was not just the exact capturing of human profiles and human faces, but it was also the idealization of them. It wasn't just a matter of how you really looked, but how you should look. And so the Mughals come across as extraordinarily polished, as extraordinarily jewel-like themselves in their profiles. And so here you see Khurram, as he was, holding up a little spinel, you see that he's resting against a beautiful cushion, a brocaded cushion which has figures incorporated in it, and the figures are sort of slightly swayed in their postures. This indicates that this textile was probably an import from Safavid Iran. That's an Iranian textile, in fact. There's his young son also holding what might be a flower or might be, in fact, a jeweled flower. It's not very clear. The throne itself, of course, is gold. And the whole opulence of the scene and the expression of the scene are beautifully married together to show the culture of the jeweled arts, not just precious objects that you own and hoard, but something that refines your life, your experience, and your expression in every possible way. So that's one of the glories of Mughal painting and of this kind of culture of jewels and beautiful objects. But we have other evidence and images of Shah Jahan also with jewels, and in fact there is a painting in the exhibition upstairs that show Shah Jahan with 3 of his sons being presented with a tray of jewels by the nobleman Asif Khan, who you might also remember from the allegorical picture that I showed you earlier. Excuse me, I'll just go back. So yeah, you can see that little tray of jewels. You can see the formal presentation. And I'm not giving you all the terrible gossip about Asif Khan and Shah Jahan. That is sort of the stuff of sort of tabloids of the 17th century. But in fact, there was a long story to do with them, because Jahangir was had 18 wives, the last of whom was Nur Jahan, the great Iranian figure who he married. Nur Jahan's brother was Asif Khan. They formed a kind of powerful cabal at court. Eventually, Nur Jahan and Asif Khan fell out with Shah Jahan, but when Jahangir died, they had to reconcile because they both lived on, and Asif Khan was particularly good at getting on with people and so on. So you see that he's completely now inserted himself into the court politics and the prestige of the next king, when in fact it wasn't so long ago that his own sister was not on speaking terms with this young man at all. So this is the kind of stories that Mughal history is filled with. But let's carry on, because the story of our gem is not over. It keeps getting better. Because the last mention of the spinel in connection with Shah Jahan concerns the description of another one of the greatest creations of the Mughal jeweled arts, and that is the Peacock Throne, the legendary Peacock Throne. Now, the Peacock Throne was one of several lavish royal seats made for Shah Jahan, but surpassing all the others. While contemporary written and painted descriptions of the thrones differ from one another, so we don't again really know objectively what that throne precisely looked like, most descriptions agree that it was a jeweled, enameled throne which had columns of some kinds rising up from the seat that held up a pavilion roof, and upon that pavilion roof were 2 enameled peacocks, which is why it's known as the Peacock Throne to us today. You can see those 2 round things up there are peacocks. But in its own time, it was known by other names. The chroniclers Lahori and Inayat Khan, who are authors of 2 very important royal histories of the period, the Padshah Nama and the Shah Jahan Nama, have described the throne, and they tell us that an inscribed spinel, which sounds very much like this one, was actually set into a niche in the throne itself. And I've recorded that whole description. If you have a minute to read it, you can. But you can see that right here it says, on it were engraved the names of Sahib-e-Qiran Temur. So that's not on our spinel. Mirza Shahrukh, Mirza Ulugh Beg, yes. And then it was inscribed and put in here. Now, again, we're not sure. Did these authors actually see this? Are they putting 3 Timurid names rather than 1 because they are sort of exaggerating the Timurid heritage or position or importance of the stone? Was there in fact a stone? If it was in fact an accurate description, that brings us into another set of possibilities, that in the period of Timur himself there was a stone inscribed with his name, which is sort of something that is, at this point, not at all verifiable. So we have to keep all of these descriptions, in our mind. But in any case, I think it's a fascinating open question, and we'll probably never know, because as you know, that the wonderful Peacock Throne was melted down and destroyed, and that was a very sad end to the throne. It was taken away to Iran in 1739, and it had a sort of afterlife in Iran, which we can discuss later. Secure in Mughal hands for now, the inscribed Timurid gem Spinel next passed down from Shah Jahan to his austere son Aurangzeb, whose inscription now joined that of his father and grandfather. The Spinel now has his title, which is Alamgir, with the date of 1070 or the 18th of September 1659, and also possibly was executed by the hand of Saida Gilani, who was still around in the time of Aurangzeb. Shah Jahan would have wished the Spinel to adorn the turban of his favorite son and chosen heir Dara Shikoh, who you saw as a child sitting on that little stool examining gems with his father. But in this fratricidal age, Dara Shikoh was killed in 1658 in the Battle of Succession by his brother Aurangzeb, who was the last of the so-called Great Mughals. Aurangzeb, and you see him here, in a painting that we have at the Met, which shows him where he spent the last 26 years. He had a very long reign of almost half a century, much of which was spent in the south, in the Deccan, where he was hell-bent on the conquest of the last remaining Deccan sultans. And this wonderful landscape that you see back here sort of indicates the Deccan landscape, which is beautifully rocky. And in fact, technically, the world's oldest rocks on planet Earth are in the Deccan region. And they formed an important they turn up in the artistic imagination of painters a lot who work in the Deccan, because they have such a powerful presence there. Now, Aurangzeb met his end in 1707. By then, the empire was both at its maximum size, but also the weakest it had ever been, overstretched for resources that had been depleted in the completion of the Deccan conquest, attacked by the Marathas in the west, vulnerable to armed European traders, and internally fraught with rebellions. The Mughal Empire was on the cusp of its long decline that lay ahead. But still, decisive blows were to follow in the 18th century, particularly the attack of Nadir Shah in 1739. The Persian invader, who took away a huge amount of the Mughal treasury, including the Peacock Throne and innumerable jewels such as the Kohinoor Diamond. And somehow the inscribed Spinel fell into the hands of his commander, Ahmad Darani, who was of Afghan origin and is the founder of the Durrani dynasty based in Afghanistan. He styled himself Durre Durrani, Pearl of Pearls, and that is the last of the inscription that is added to the gem, in a Nastaliq inscription and dated 1755. The inscribed Spinel next only makes its appearance only in the 20th century, by which stage it had acquired an almost legendary reputation in the world of great gems. So great was the legend of this gem that several other great inscribed Spinels are quite often mistaken for it. For example, a necklace in the collection of the Queen of England, which also contains a magnificent inscribed Spinel, is also known as the Timur ruby, but the only actual gem in history surviving that has that lineage from Ulugh Beg onwards is the one that we've discussed. And it's upstairs for you to see. So, the story of the Timurid Spinel leads us into the wider developments in the courtly jeweled arts of the Mughal age. It was under Akbar, the greatest king of the Mughal Empire, who ruled from 1555 to 1605, that the empire was expanded and consolidated, and a number of court practices and ceremonies became formalized, and in which context many of the fabulously decorated objects on show and the show of wealth and glamour can be contextualized. Central to this was the image of the emperor himself, whose appearance and wearing of jewelry became emblematic of his power and status and set a custom or standard which others followed. Among the opulent items was a turban ornament that was sort of worn by all the rulers and all the courtiers, and this is one magnificent example that's in the show upstairs. Mughal rulers wore egret feathers in their turbans, which were weighted down at the end with a bead. This followed the example of their Mongol ancestors who wore owl feathers in their turbans, but the Mughals were also aware of the European aigrette, which had come into fashion and was worn by many European visitors to court. The feather plume shape evolved into turban ornaments, interpreted as the feather in a stiffened form made of gold and set with gems, and such as rubies and emeralds that you see here, and diamonds as well. And there were many other forms of courtly regalia that came to be recognizable parts of the presentation at court. A powerfully organized central administration system at the Mughal court involved the Mansabdari system, a series of ranks and honors and duties that involved the giving of inam, or royal presents. These took the form of khilat, or robes of honor, and also often ceremonial weapons or other forms of jeweled arts. The jeweled arts extended to include these personal ornaments that I described, and the court chronicler Abul Fazl mentions 37 types of jeweled ornaments, and also goes to length to describe the famous kundan technique that is the unique tradition of Indian jewelers. And Abul Fazl tells us, in other countries, jewels are secured into the sockets made for them with lac, but in Hindustan it is effected with kundan, which is a gold made so pure and ductile that the fable of the gold of Parvez that he could mold with his hands becomes credible. This reference to the gold of Parvez is to Khusro Parvez, the last Sasanian king of Iran, and refers to the soft moldability of gold, which in Kundan is so pure that at a molecular level it forms a strong bond with gems that are embedded that are embedded into it, and it becomes as fast as anything else, and it fixes gems. Abul Fazl also lists the many types of workers and gold workers and gem workers that were in the court, and I hope you've been able to have a look at all the different functions that are listed in the Ain-e-Akbari that I've put up here. Now, there's a great variety of dagger hilts and blades evolved, and many are catalogued and described in Salam Kaugji's recent publication of the Al-Sabah collection. These include the chilanam, the punch dagger, the qatar, the pistol grip dagger, and naturalistic styles of animal-headed daggers, which perhaps recall early nomadic traditions of Central Asia, as she suggested. Such daggers can be seen in use or worn in waistbands in various 16th century paintings. And here's an example. If you look closely, you'll see many sort of daggers doing all sorts of terrible things to people in this painting. But seen up close, the fine quality and aesthetic power of these pieces can be truly appreciated. Shown here is a chilanam dagger of the late 16th century. The principal decoration is with rubies and turquoises, all set in the gold kundan technique that Abul Fazl described. There's a bud-like finial above, which is typical of the naturalistic touches that you see in Mughal art. A qatar dagger is also lavishly set with rubies and emeralds, and in this case, different techniques of setting can also be shown, such as these sort of channel settings of rubies that you see up on these areas here. And the wonderful thing here is that this actually seems to have its original scabbard. Other forms of dagger seen in the Mughal period are more naturalistic. Among them is this one at the Met, which is one of my favorite objects at the Met. I've lived with it for so many years, and I've never grown tired of it because it is an extraordinary, extraordinary dagger. Its hilt is carved in the shape of a Nilgai head, and the principal material in this case is nephrite. Nephrite is a very hard stone to carve and presents a great challenge to the carver in shaping it into naturalistic curving forms and fine detail. However, the high degree of sensitivity seen here, which outlines the veins that you can see on the nose and the tips of the ears, which are translucent, they speak volumes to the kind of high level, the artistic merit and the high level of creativity and sensitivity that these artists were capable of. And what's interesting is, when I browse around the Met's collections, I often go by the ancient Assyrian reliefs. And when you look up there, they say that the ancient Middle East is the cradle of all human civilization, and every idea that you ever have later finds its roots in the ancient Middle East. Well, sure enough, you find those little animal-headed daggers there, and finials at the ends of the armbands that you may be able to see, that also show, right there, that also show that same idea of a finial ending in an animal head. This is a marvelous dagger that's also up on view, and it takes full advantage of the fact that nephrite jade comes in those shades of color that I told you about, because here the base is made out of a certain color of nephrite, a very dark, almost black color, but the little leaves that are inlaid are also nephrite, but in a different color, same material. And they're inlaid in this kind of pattern of repeating floral forms, which is something that you begin to see in the development of Mughal textiles. That dagger always reminds me of Mughal textiles, and the hallmark of the Mughal decorative arts which was the development of a single flowering form shown from top to bottom and in repetition across a surface. And finally, one of the most famous daggers in the collection is this one. This one, which is, this extraordinary dagger, which is survives with its heavily decorated hilt. This masterpiece of opulence and design shows an intricately laid out pattern of rubies and other gems which form large medallions. So distinctive is this design that some scholars believe it to be the very same dagger Jahangir is wearing in this picture, where he is shown meeting with his vizier and father-in-law, Itmad-ud-Dawla. And on the level of gossip, Itmad-ud-Dawla is in fact the father of Asif, is his father-in-law, and he's married to Nur Jahan. He's the father of Asif Khan and Nur Jahan. So you see what a tight circle of Mughal officers and nobles we're talking about, all giving each other high prestigious presents and jobs. But that's, not allowed anymore, so. So I want to mention swords because they occupied a very special place in Mughal court ceremony. There are a few swords up in the exhibition too. Not only were they emblems of strength and prowess on the battlefield, but they also bore high honorific status in terms of gift giving or inam. Swords were also named in the Mughal period, just like famous swords in Western literature like Excalibur, or perhaps closer to the idea of a sword in Islamic literature, such as the two-bladed sword of Imam Ali, which is known as Zulfiqar. The Italian physician Manucci, who visited the court of Aurangzeb, made a list of all the names of swords that were stored in the royal store. He also made lists of the names of royal elephants and the names of the royal concubines, which somehow sound very similar to each other. Finally, one is never sure if Badam Chasham, almond eyes, or Dil Pasand, beloved heart's delight, refers to the emperor's elephant, wife, or sword. But these are some of the names, wonderful names, that Manucci recorded of the swords. Archers' rings were another category of Mughal hearthstone that were also presented to nobles as a sign of favor. These distinctively shaped rings were designed to protect the surface of the thumb from the power of the string of the bow as it is released. Made of hearthstones and precious materials, over time these became objects of symbolic meaning, and as I said, they were given as presents and symbols to important nobles. And here you see some delightful examples from the collection. This one is made out of banded agate that naturally occurs in layers of color, and how skillfully it's been cut and arranged so that the two circles come perfectly in the right position. This one is, of course, enameled, and they would have been worn in a belt which would have been held in place with a sash holder like this. And I think it's wonderful that we can see the reverse of the sash holder, because you can see how elegantly carved the reverse is. The side that wouldn't even have been seen by anybody is in the form of a sensitive, naturalistic floral petal, floral head. And if you look carefully in these paintings, you can see how the bands and the sashes and sometimes archers' rings and so on were all worn. Again, it's really instructive to be able to look closely at the Mughal paintings that are by the objects. Another archer's ring here, in very small, very fine calligraphy, has the 99 names of God on it, inlaid into it in gold. And in fact, this arrangement of 99 names is something that became incredibly important to the Mughal emperors at a certain point. If you visit the tomb of Jahangir in Lahore, you will see that the actual cenotaph is also decorated with the 99 names of God. And you find this important arrangement in various other places. I remember this Quran had an interesting story because as great collectors know, sometimes you don't manage to get things all at the same time and in the perfect way that you would want. From what I recall, the manuscript, which is this right here, which has a jade cover here, it's a wonderful, tiny little, very delicate Quran, was acquired in one sale, I think, and then separately, many years later, a box came along, a beautiful enameled box, and when the collector put the Quran in the box, it was evident that the two were probably once meant to be together, and they were made for each other, but had gotten separated over time. So you actually sometimes find these funny coincidences in the world of collectors. So I'm just going to go through a few more, wonderful things that are in the show, and I'm going to end my talk today by taking us away from the Mughal world and further south into the land of diamonds, the Deccan Plateau of India. This part of the country was home to 5 Deccan sultans who were holding out against Mughal conquest for much of the 17th century. The exhibition has a portrait of Shah Raju, a spiritual advisor of the Sultan of Bijapur, who was they were great patrons of art, but their art had a slightly different quality about it. And this tells you something about the way, the almost metaphorical way in which Deccani artists express themselves. And I think one of the great contrasts between the Mughal world and the Deccan world is exactly on the point of observation and idealization, where the Mughals were greatly committed to logic, and the artists were greatly trained to document the world around them. But the Deccani artists had a little bit more freedom of imagination, and they went quite often for metaphorical ways of expressing the things that they observed or felt. What I think is so wonderful about this horse, it's a very subtle thing, but I don't know if you can see it. Here's Shah Raju, and here he is on his horse. But if you look very closely, right in front of the horse, emerging from his mouth is hot breath, because he's hot and he's trotting along, and it's a hot day in the Deccan. And you can actually feel that horse breathing. Just a wonderful touch of the Deccani imagination, as you also see it in that finial, which is probably Deccani too. But now the Golconda region in the Deccan was the main source for all of the world's diamonds from antiquity until the 18th century. In the 18th century, diamonds were discovered in Brazil, and in the 19th century in Africa. But for the many centuries preceding those discoveries, the Golconda Diamond reigned supreme, and its prestige was established around the world from ancient Greece to the Far East, recognized as being the hardest substance on the earth, as well as a symbol of purity and fortune. With the arrival of Europeans in India at the end of the 15th century, the trade in diamonds increased, and some of the most famous examples in history have legends that accompany them from this period. However, when a large and magnificent diamond was discovered at a Golconda mine, the first place that it was meant to be sent is not abroad, but straight to the greatest connoisseurs of the material, the sultans of the Deccan courts or their Mughal overlords further north. This 56.7 carat diamond on display here is one such example. It is gently and irregularly faceted to preserve its volume and shaped into the form of an amulet or a taviz. So magnificent is this gem that it doesn't need anything more than a simple string passing through the holes above, just to be worn plain and simple without any setting around the neck. It also has a beautiful pale pink color, which is typical of Golconda. And these are 2 more diamonds also from the same collection. The Deccan style of mounting diamonds seems to favor their clarity and see-through quality. A set of pendants in the show demonstrate the so-called azure style of setting, which holds the diamonds in place without any backing. We can see this type of setting in the necklaces worn by ladies at the Deccan court. And if you look closely at kalamkari, which is another great product of the Deccan, which is the painted and dyed textiles that were produced in the Golconda region. When you look at an example of a kalamkari, you can see that the ladies are actually wearing open work. This is from the 17th century, this kalamkari. And you can see that they're wearing open set diamonds, very similar to the pendant that you see up here. I have actually held that pendant up to the eye, and I have actually looked at the world through that diamond, and I can tell you that the world indeed is a very pretty place when viewed through a Golconda diamond. So with that, I hope I've been able to convey some of my enthusiasm for this material and contextualize it in the history and the technology and the tastes of the Mughal period. And I thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you enjoy the show. Thank you.